be able to check off these boxes. I think what the commission is expecting is that there will be a third phase for this proceeding in order to accomplish the objectives that we've identified in the proceeding. So I will be frank when I state that based on the report that we received from the parties, it did not feel that the objectives had been met, and it was very dismissive of the objectives. So as we go through today, we're going to focus primarily on, the content of that, the objectives of the team, and then try to align the commission's guidance along with the parties' efforts. And so, without further ado, I will turn it back over to Ashley, and we'll begin with a presentation, I believe, from HECO or the parties.
Thank you, Jenny. So to provide an overview for today's status conference, I'll briefly go over the objectives and agenda for today. Andrew, if you could get the slides up. Okay. So as set forth in our agenda, the meeting objectives, next slide, are that the attendees are aware of the working group's progress to date and key next steps, including the status of the Phase 2 working group report. Also, one of our objective is that attendees have the opportunity to ask clarifying questions and provide feedback to the working group and commission and staff. So a brief overview of the agenda. Next slide, please. So the working group will go first and provide an update on the progress made to date in the working group discussions and activities. This will be followed by an opportunity for questions and answers. As indicated in the agenda sent out earlier this week, the Commission has prepared some questions that it will be asking during the question and answer. Preliminary questions were issued with the agenda, and we note that the working group has provided answers in the slides that were filed earlier this week. Following our Q&A period will be an open comment period during which all participants will have an opportunity to ask clarifying questions and to provide feedback. Finally, Commission staff will wrap up with an overview of next steps. So we'll now proceed with the working group's update, and I will turn this over to the working group co-chairs.
Thanks, Ashley. I'll share my screen. Okay, so everyone can see it. I'll get started. So my name is Kristen Senda. I'm a program manager at Hawaiian Electric in Customer Energy Resources, and also the co-lead for the Microgrid Services Tariff Working Group alongside Marcy Chang from Consumer Advocate. Okay, so I just want to start off by saying thank you, commissioners and commission staff for your time and attention today, and we look forward to sharing our progress to date. So our agenda we put together today, going to start with a review of Act 200 and how we feel that the working group has been aligning to its original purpose and intent. We'll then go through a review of different microgrid development pathways that we've mapped out. And we thought that was a good way to just start the discussion, get everyone level set, because when we say microgrid, there's a lot of different types. So we just want to make that clear in the beginning. And then we'll next go through our working group progress. I did a recap just from the past 4 meetings. So I didn't want to recap the meetings from before the last status conference. So just be the last 4 meetings. And then also a summary of our key learnings. And then wanted to do a quick highlight on the community outreach events that have just started this week, since that's relevant to this proceeding. I'll quickly go over remaining working plan and then our responses to the preliminary questions that were filed on October 24th, and appreciate getting those questions in advance and getting us started in the right direction. Okay, no further ado. So for Act 200, we have been constantly looking back at the Act to make sure that we are aligned. And, the main purpose of Act 200 was to encourage and facilitate microgrid development through the tariff. And so the working group feels strongly that this was achieved in phase one with the Microgrid Service Tariff that was filed. And we feel that it does encourage and facilitate opportunities through existing as well as future DER and grid services rates, programs, and procurements. We also saw that, Act 200, it really acknowledged the need for a more resilient grid. And that's, what spurred it in the beginning with the hurricanes in Puerto Rico. And so what we did early on in phase two is we identified ongoing resilience efforts that's happening in other dockets, and primarily, in IGP, DER, as well as the North Kohala RFP. And lastly, Act 200, it also acknowledged that microgrid development has been limited in Hawaii, and we recognize that as well. So a big part of the working group efforts was to understand what the barriers to development are. So as in phase one, we continued doing that and solicited and gathered very valuable input from both developers and government representatives. And I'll go through that in our progress as well. And then lastly, also to address development, the ETIP, so Energy Transitions Initiative Partnership Project with NREL started earlier this year, and that was, a follow-up from phase one. And so that project has been happening in parallel with this proceeding. So we did get an update from them, and we do note that their community outreach events are happening this month and next month, and they will have a final map of potential hybrid microgrid sites on Oahu for public use and a report at the end of this year. So next slide. So when we talk about microgrid pathways, and sorry if this is a little bit of an eye chart, but we wanted to diagram it out because there's a lot of different scenarios. So when we say that a customer or a developer or community even, is interested in a microgrid, and the question is how can they achieve that? There's a lot of different paths. So the first major decision point is to determine if utility infrastructure is required, so namely distribution lines. And so if it's not, if it's fully behind the meter and it's just serving the customer's own load, that's pretty simple, right? It then is described as or it's labeled as a customer microgrid, as in the tariff. And then if they want to seek compensation, there are existing DER programs that they then need to apply to. So Customer Grid Supply Plus, Smart Export, Battery Bonus, or a Grid Services Purchase Agreement. So both DER programs or grid services. And then if they don't qualify for those, there's always the customer self-supply and standard interconnection programs, which allows them to offset their bill and still provide benefit there. So on the top hand, the more complicated and technical option is if an aggregate of customers want to form a hybrid microgrid that would require utility infrastructure. That would so that the tariff calls it a hybrid microgrid, but want to note that on the mainland and elsewhere in other jurisdictions, it's referred to as a community microgrid. So I want to put that out there that throughout the presentation, I may say community microgrid, but in our purposes, we're referring to a hybrid microgrid. So if they chose to go this route, there's again two types there where it's either initiated by the utility or initiated by the community or by a private entity or combination of both. And so if it's done privately and not through the utility, that's where they can also use the tariff and use the rules and application there. And then in addition, they would also apply to an existing DER and or grid services program, depending if they want to seek compensation and if they qualify for those programs. We did add this arrow up here to show that there is somewhat of a feedback loop or potentially a feedback loop if the community decides that they want to get the utility more involved. There's always that option there. And so similarly, if the utility initiates a project that can be developed through planning and program processes. So example, there would be North Kohala. And through this too, we put a feedback loop again, because even in a utility initiated project, there's a community involvement and community engagement in that process. And so there's a lot of discussions to determine what is the best structure for that microgrid. Okay. So moving on to our working group progress. And so again, this is just recapping the last 4 meetings. I didn't want to rehash all the meetings from earlier this year, but I just want to say that we've had, very full agendas and a lot of great guest speakers and presentations. So I've highlighted that here in purple. So our first meeting, I guess our 5th meeting actually in August, we had a presentation from Enchanted Rock and NELHA, Natural Energy Laboratory of Hawaii Authority. And this was really in response to the Commission's guidance letter that was received, I think, June 30th, which encourages to continue getting the developer perspective and understanding the barriers. So that was really the intent of this first meeting. And then the next meeting, we reached out to the California Public Utilities Commission staff because we wanted to learn more about their microgrid incentive program and understand what we could take away here in Hawaii. And we also had a presentation by our working group member, Paul DiMartini, on the Calistoga Community Microgrid in California. So he talked through how this example in Northern California is somewhat, it could be similar to Hawaii because it's a relatively small size. And they went through multiple reiterations of how a community microgrid could be structured. And then finally, on that day, later on that day, same day actually, the Hawaii State Energy Office held a webinar going through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funding and how that will be distributed in Hawaii. So we did direct the working group members to attend that, and we recapped it in the next meeting. Our 7th meeting, we had another guest speaker from the California Public Utilities Commission to understand how they're approaching the value of resiliency, specifically for microgrids. And then we had a presentation from Hawaii Electric on the North Kohala microgrid as a case study for utility operated microgrids. In that meeting as well, we also distributed and reviewed the draft outline for the report. And then in the next meeting, we provided an actual Word document. And we had a presentation from Hawaii Electric on the resilience application, as well as IGP Resilience Working Group next steps and how that relates to microgrids as well. So I want to thank all the guest speakers that attended. They provided a lot of really great insight, and I think we had a lot of good key learnings that came out of that. So for this presentation, we did want to focus on our key learnings because we felt that it sets the stage for the report and gets us all aligned, hopefully. So happy to have that discussion further later today. So one of our first key learnings is something that was brought up early on, and it was that the tariff and this proceeding should really focus on practical considerations in Hawaii. We did look at California a lot for what they're doing, but we always took the conversation back to say, how could this be applied in Hawaii? Because some things that may work on the mainland, of course, may not work in Hawaii. So one of the key points was, when we did have a presentation from NELHA, they explained to us that they, at one point, were considering a larger hybrid microgrid, but really determined that the value wasn't there because their electric service reliability was above average. So from there, they de-scoped it to a smaller customer microgrid project, which is going through the standard interconnection program and getting constructed today. And then for North Kohala, that was a case study, in Hawaii that's being proposed. So that was another great example of something practical that can be done today to improve the grid resiliency. For the second one, this is what we heard a lot from the California Public Utilities Commission, and it was a really great reminder and a great way to look at microgrids, that it's really DER at its core. And so this definition came from the CPUC, but it matched how we were thinking as well. And it was just more of a reminder that microgrids are just a combination of DER resources. And so if we look at it that way, the working group feels that there's a lot of existing, programs and a docket that addresses incentives in that way. Third, we heard this specifically from Alan Sherritt and Enchanted Rock that microgrids are just not built to meet 100% of load, and if they are, it's typically not for a very long islanded mode duration, just mainly due to the extreme high cost of the capacity required. And this, to put in context, he was speaking about microgrids on the mainland and where land is cheaper. And Enchanted Rock, they also primarily work with microgrids powered by natural gas, which is even less feasible for us in Hawaii. So to hear that perspective from Enchanted Rock was a very good reminder for us. And then also in the Calistoga Community Microgrid case study, we learned that again, the city of Calistoga or the town of Calistoga, wanted to serve 100% of the load, but just feasibly it wasn't possible. So their first attempt, they did a feasibility study, and to cover their town of approximately 2,000 people, it was going to cost roughly $10 million, and that would have only powered, I think, 3 or 4 or 5, very small select community sites. Next slide. This is kind of a follow-up of that last point, but in particular, hybrid microgrids are economically and financially difficult to develop. And this we heard a lot from Alan, sure, because Enchanted Rock, they primarily do develop customer microgrids, and they do have experience in community or hybrid microgrids, but this was his feedback that hybrid microgrids are just not cost effective, and it really takes the utility investment and initiative to do so because there's a lot of switching and protection equipment upgrades. And if you wanted to do a clean energy powered solar and storage, that's the most expensive, unfortunately, the most expensive type, mainly due to the large footprint. And he called out that it's typically requires 400 times more space than a diesel backup generator. Okay, fifth, we did hear a lot from California. And so in summary, we're learning that California is utilizing a planning approach to community microgrid development. And so specifically, that's in their Track 5 proceeding, and they're pursuing that through the grid planning process, but also they have established clear criteria that define critical facilities and community needs. And they're really taking a holistic approach where they're really concerned about equity and access issues as well. And then our second point, which we heard from them, is even though they have a microgrid incentive program, the implementation plan has just been filed, and so that hasn't been approved yet. And so obviously they're still working through a lot of open issues such as equity, safety, and technical operations. And also just want to call out that they have a $200 million ratepayer funded program, and that is meant to, or it's estimated to fund approximately 15 projects. So again, they're also estimating roughly $10 million price tag per community or hybrid microgrid project. And then lastly, we heard this from multiple presentations, but microgrids are, a single tool in the toolkit to support our grid resiliency goals. And so the community needs may be better served with a grid-based solution or larger substation-based microgrid, as opposed to a smaller hybrid microgrid that only provides resilience to a few facilities, just from, I think, a cost-effective standpoint, and maybe more effective as well. And our second point, when we had a presentation on the resilience application, that program is really focusing on preventative measures, specifically system hardening, to then enable microgrids to perform during emergencies. And this is actually a point that was reiterated in the community outreach meeting I attended last night out in Waianae. One of the community members, she really hit it on the head where they were being asked about where microgrids could occur, and she brought up, microgrids are useless if the infrastructure isn't hardened. So I thought that was really great to hear that from the community, that they recognize that as well. And that's exactly what the working group learned through this process as well. Okay, so yes, segueing into the community outreach events, I just want to highlight this. They just started this week. The first one was on Monday in Kahuku. The one last night was in Waianae. And the attendance of the first one was a little low, but the one last night had much broader participation. So that's really encouraging for the remaining 4. And I just do want to call out to the ETIP team. Ken Aramaki particularly is doing a great job leading that effort. I thought it was really well organized, and it's because there's an in-person event. It's also online on WebEx or Zoom, I believe, and it's also being broadcasted on Alelo. So there's multiple ways for folks to listen in and get involved, and also to provide feedback. So there's multiple times during the meeting where they asked the community questions, either in person, online through the chat, or through Menti, with a QR code. And there was quite a lot of participation last night. So that was, again, very encouraging, and looking forward to seeing all that documented in the final report later this year. Okay, so the remaining work plan is pretty short because we are nearing the end of the procedural timeline. So we do have one more working group meeting scheduled on November 9th. And in that meeting, we're going to focus on finalizing the report and recommendations. And then we will have a recap then as well about the community outreach events that's happened so far and the feedback that's been received. And then we'll plan to file the report on November 23rd. And we will look forward to reconvening again here at the next technical conference in December. Okay, so that ends my main portion of the presentation, and so we'll get into the preliminary questions. So I want to thank you again for submitting them. So we had time to review earlier on. So the first question, around North Kohala, the main question is because there was an IR and it asked, why didn't North Kohala use the tariff? And in that response, I think part of the response was saying that the North Kohala BES size of 5 megawatts exceeds the max capacity of the tariff, which is 1 megawatt. And so the question is, are tariff design issues such as the size of eligible projects being revisited so similar future projects could move forward via the tariff? If not, why not? And so the working group, we feel that the size is a different issue. It maybe should have responded that are in a different way, but we feel strongly that the tariff design, including the capacity limits, does not prohibit its use for micro development. And we also didn't hear that it was a barrier. And this is because, as designed, the tariff was intended to support and provide opportunities for independent development of microgrids. And it was recognized in phase 1 that utility developed microgrids would require more complex commercial agreement, not unlike energy and storage PPAs. And so, like I said earlier, what we heard from developers in the presentation, it's more of the cost and complexity of hybrid microgrids that are the challenges, and not necessarily the capacity limits. And then the second bullet point, just wanted to clarify that the North Kohala microgrid is in fact a utility-initiated effort to improve reliability and resiliency for the North Kohala community. And so the proposed project is a utility-operated microgrid, hybrid microgrid using a third-party battery energy storage system. So in this instance, a tariff or microgrid operating agreement is needed. And so this goes back to that first diagram I showed where there's 2 different pathways, right? And if it's a utility initiated, then a tariff is not needed. So I can pause here to see if there's any follow-up questions, or I can move on to the next question. I prefer.
I think we can ask now if there are any follow-up questions to this particular question.
Okay.
I have a follow-up question. Earlier, Kristen, in your presentation, you mentioned that as part of the Microgrid Services Tariff, the utility could also serve as the microgrid operator. And so how was that considered at all prior to pursuing the current approach for the North Kohala microgrid?
So I personally don't want to speak for the North Kohala team. I'm not sure if anyone's from Hawaiian Electric is on that can speak to that. Take that as a question to take back and follow up with you. Okay. Yeah, we can take that as a question and provide answer in the next working group meeting.
Were there any other follow-up questions? Okay, hearing and seeing none, Kristen, I think we can move to the next preliminary question.
Okay, so question number 2, this was about the working group report in the initial draft. The working group presented docket parties' areas of consensus. So the question is, were there any key areas of disagreements among the parties that the commission should be aware of? What are the key remaining issues the working group has yet to discuss? And what, if any, challenges do you foresee in addressing these in remaining time? And so, you know, fortunately, I'm happy to report that there were no key areas of disagreement as well, or forcing challenges among the parties. And, you know, it's been really great working with Marcy and Jerry so far. And I think thankfully we've been in alignment on a lot of these issues. But I'll stop there and I'll let Marcy or Jerry speak as well. I don't want to be the only one speaking on this question.
No, I agree, Kristen. And I think right now the focus is on developing the report, which I think we still have to go through. There are some details in there that we need to discuss. But yeah, right now and in general, there's no key areas of disagreement.
Thanks, Marcy. Yeah, so like she said, in terms of the remaining time, we're focusing on the report as well as, you know, an appendix document, which it will provide an overview and related considerations of development process. And we're hoping that will make more clear of how microgrids, particularly hybrid microgrids in Hawaii, can be developed today, and what our recommendation is to see projects, you know, on the ground as soon as possible.
Yeah, this is Jerry. Let me, if I might, supplement.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, supplement Marcy's comments. I think it's fair to say that the process that the working group went through was obviously to start with Act 200, as we all know, but also to look at very, very extensively as we could, with the help of people like Paul DiMartini, as well as the other people, private sector and CPUC from California, as to what California was doing and also what other states were doing. And as all of that information and learning, to use Kristen's term, occurred during the progress of the working group's analysis, initial questions that were raised and questions that occurred as we went along were addressed and, if not answered, at least approached by, you know, the guest speakers that we had and other inputs that we got from working group members. So it ended up, I mean, it may seem that it's unusual that there are no points of disagreement or challenges, but quite frankly, in looking through how you might do microgrids in the Hawaii context, trying to take as much insight and lessons learned from what was being done and has been done on the mainland, and how what the mainland projects were approached, what needs they meant to cover, and what success or issues they ran into. All of that worked through and came through really not necessarily an automatic consensus, but a clear and I think common understanding of what is involved in developing microgrids, number one, but also number two, what could be involved in developing microgrids in Hawaii and how could we make it work? And in that whole process, what was the role of the tariff in making that work? So in working through all of that, we've come to a variety of not only increases in knowledge, but also understanding and insights as to how this applies to the Hawaii context. And quite candidly, as a result of that, I don't think there were any real arguments or disagreements. There were questions that were asked, and right questions in many cases, but they were approached and either answered or approaches identified, and then we moved on. So it's a little bit of a long-winded discussion on the process, but the process in this case, I think, helped very much to bring the working group to the current state of its deliberations and consensus at this point. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. I was going to make a point too that, I want to thank the commission for having this proceeding and putting the timeline together, because I think the working group progress really benefited from these discussions, and we achieved, I think, a lot more clarity over this past year by learning from a lot of the guest presentations and speakers. On to question 3. So this is in terms of the identified objectives. And so the question is, it appears that some of the objectives as listed originally are no longer being pursued. Do you agree with that assessment? If so, briefly explain why. And so we believe that the objectives were pursued through the discussions. And I think it's because the microgrid developers, they were the ones who explained to us that, for example, voluntary islanding of microgrids in non-emergency situations is just not practical, given that microgrids are not designed to serve 100% of its load. And this would then islanding during normal conditions would require curtailment of customer load, which is contrary to what customers would presumably pay for. And so I think we probably should have, adjusted our objectives after that, but we felt that we at least pursued and addressed the objectives, and that's how we're approaching this report. And then in terms of grid services, we feel that the tariff, through our discussions, mainly that when we view that microgrids are at its core DER, we then realized that the tariff does currently encourage a wide range of opportunities for valuable grid services.
Were there any follow-up questions to the working group's answers here?
Hi, Ashley. Yes, I have one. This is Jennifer Potter. Just wanted to bring up a couple of scenarios that that are not considered in the report that you provided. And so I'm curious on how you address those objectives, these objectives about how we provide service to our customers. On Molokai, for example, there's at the end of the line, there's no power. People have, when the sun goes down, they have no electricity. And those are perfect examples of how can we provide people with the same opportunities in Hawaii to excel in their lifestyle than if we don't somehow address those types of issues. And in order to like string line or do what we need to do, is that the best and the most cost-effective way of doing this? Or for resiliency purposes, when in these isolated communities, is it not appropriate to consider a more expensive but a solution? I mean, and that And that's one example. And the other example that I had was actually here in Maui, where I live in Lahaina. Actually, I live in Napili, and we run power like 25 miles across the island in order to get to my home. And so there's some real sea level rise conditions in resiliency, all of that, all of those considerations. You know, are we able to receive service through the next 10 years at all? I mean, is that something that we should be counting on or planning for customers on other islands that are experiencing long lead lines to provide power to their homes? Should we be considering an option that can address those communities proactively before, you know, we do have an emergency scenario? And I have another follow-up.
Sure. Yeah, I can take a stab at that. And to appreciate you bringing up those two examples, that helps us understand your perspective and what we can do to make that clear in the report. But I'll say that for the tariff specifically, that was created and established in phase one, that really provided customers or developers, communities, the opportunity to propose a hybrid microgrid. So that option is there. And so then what we heard from developers is that, it's the cost burden is too high for a community to take that upon themselves. And so the other option then is to have a utility initiated microgrid or resilience initiative. And so that I think should be addressed in the larger IGP process, which I'm personally not involved. I'm not sure if there's anyone else on the line from Hoyning Electric that wants to speak to the IGP process. Or Marcy, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to add, Commissioner Potter, that is one of the main objectives that actually the working group was striving to get at, I think. I think, the process itself, the speakers that we had come in was sort of like a journey for us. I think, having the commission's objectives that we're trying to address, I think with that overarching goal that you just discussed, Commissioner Potter, is really what got us to the place that we are right now. I kind of wanted to build on what Jerry said because I think he succinctly said it. I think we learned a lot that I think, through development of other microgrids, that for hybrid microgrids especially, I think that the utility involvement is very important. And if we want to get there, we were trying to figure out what is the most expeditious way to get there, because we fully get, those concerns that you're raising, and that we want to facilitate microgrid growth as expeditiously as possible. Yeah. So I think some of the recommendations that we're getting to is hopefully trying to get to the point where to try to address those concerns that you're raising, Commissioner.
Yeah, this is Jerry. If I could supplement both Kristen and Marcy. Commissioner, you raised very, very key points. And I must say that when this whole process began and we had the early working group sessions, I did raise, and some of you might remember, potential examples of microgrids. And I used primarily on this island, Haleiwa, in the North Shore as one point. As we got more into our in-depth and extensive exploration, not only of microgrids, but how you do it, and once you do it, what's involved in maintaining the microgrids, we had a very interesting, I think, insight that was very compellingly, if you will, raised by one of the people from California's PUC. And that was the question, what is the need that you're trying to resolve? And once you identify that need, what are the different alternatives that you have to meet that need? And if microgrid is one of those alternatives, is it the best or the optimum alternative to meet that need? And I think the needs assessment is very, very critical. Not only that, you have people at the end of the line and therefore intuitively they're subject to all kinds of vulnerabilities, But if the goal is to provide constant, reliable, resilient power, then the question is, what are the alternatives to meet that need? And what the California people said is, microgrids may not necessarily be the best. And your exact example about being at the end of the line, which was, my kind of initial concept of Haleiwa being at the end of the line, is Borrego. And Borrego was at the end of, what is it, PG&E's, or I forget which utility it was, but their line. And the ultimate conclusion was what they call a community and what we would call a hybrid microgrid. The utility took the initiative to develop that. It got a whole bunch of people in Borrego to come on with their own DERs that were part of that. And that's how they resolved the problem. The other issue, of course, would be to harden and expand the transmission line, which apparently was looked at and was, rejected as either too expensive or not necessarily practical. So, the question then is, in your situation in Lahaina or in Molokai situation, or even in Haleiwa situation, and there are other remote areas on all of the islands that we know about, would it be an alternative, a realistic alternative? An alternative, yes, but a realistic alternative. And when one gets into what a microgrid is and how complex it is in terms of both the design as well as the construction, and particularly the operation and maintenance once it's there, most of the examples that we have found on the mainland have either the utility as essentially the microgrid operator, or a private entity like Clean Power or the Enchanted, where they are the developer of that project and also serve on as the O&M operator or the microgrid operator. So, the idea of just sticking up a microgrid at the end of a long line, it's a great concept, but when you get into the practicalities of it, and when you get into the needs analysis, and then back off of that as what are the alternatives to meet that need, you get into a whole different realm of thinking. And quite frankly, that's what the California PUC people emphasize to us. What is the need and what are the ways to do it? And is a microgrid the best way to do it? So we just raised that, and that's one of the reasons why we came to the conclusions that are tentatively stated and Kristen and Marcy indicated. And then on the questions of islanding, again, while voluntary islanding in a normal situation, sounds theoretically plausible and even maybe attractive, if you can imagine, going on and off the grid, etc. From an engineering standpoint, and people like Paul and others can speak much more authoritatively to this than I can, but it's not that simple. And two, if you look at other examples, and one of the prime examples in my mind is Princeton University, which has its own microgrid. They also seem to have, I believe, a 15 megawatt cogen unit on campus that they've always used that supplements, wind and solar that they have, so that they can microgrid. They don't go on and off except when the grid goes down, if it ever goes down. So the voluntary islanding, while theoretically possible, seems to be impractical in everybody's minds that we spoke with. Thanks.
Thank you, Jerry. I'm going to follow up on that point. So I'm thinking about a community center that's been opened for people that have experienced a hurricane and they need shelter, and they're on a microgrid at this community center. And but the power's out across the entire island, except for these hotspots where there's actually a microgrid that's there. I'm assuming that in that kind of setting, that you better be able to serve 100% of the load of those community centers or at the hospital or However, I mean, it's not, you would not design a microgrid to not withstand an emergency situation where you would need to rely upon it to provide services, water and blankets to consumers or to our residents. So I'm not entirely sure if you're just thinking of this being a more optional type of microgrid or if it's a critical microgrid, if that makes a distinction between 100% of the load being carried or not. So can you elaborate on that a little bit for me?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And in fact, that's one of the things that I personally was really interested in, but also that the working group was interested in. I think we distinguish two types of situations and recognize that we're talking primarily about so-called hybrid or community microgrids. If you have a single facility, such as a hospital or the community center as an emergency shelter that you mentioned, Jenny, or a police station or fire station or some complex like that, okay? Yes, you could build a microgrid which would seek to give 100% power for a relatively long duration, meaning I guess 96 hours or more. But what you would be doing is developing your own power system, okay? So you could have, presumably in a more practical sense, you could have, and this is down on the mainland, you could have solar, you could have battery, but in almost all cases on the mainland, including the projects, that Wisconsin has pursued, you have either diesel or natural gas backup, okay? And obviously diesel is expensive and emissions, we know all of that, and it doesn't last forever, and you've got to start it up periodically, etc. Natural gas is probably a different ball game, and there are smaller natural gas turbines, and it's much more prevalent on the mainland and accessible and affordable. So in those kinds of situations, yes. And in fact, Wisconsin has pursued, as far as I know, a number of projects aimed at communities and specifically that kind of thing, not to provide power even partially, let alone 100% for the entire community, but to do so for specific, very critical facilities. And those generally, as you suggested, come to hospitals, police, fire, civil defense, educational facilities, especially where you can shelter people. And it's that sheltering like the Red Cross does. That's a key example. But the other one also, quite frankly, is grocery stores and service stations, because you need, without power, the food spoils, right? At least the non-canned food spoils and so forth. So yes, very critically, you can have, shall we say, smaller critical facility microgrids that are so limited, and they can be 100% or at least strive to be that. But the essential element is to have that backup element. And everybody on the mainland, has either diesel or natural gas. Unfortunately, we can have diesel, but natural gas is, they're more difficult here. So without question, and if we wanted to, for example, say, Queens Hospital, Kaiser, the police station, they could all go critical facility, single microgrid, no question about that. Somebody would have to pay for it, but they could still be done, and it probably should be done. And that's what that New York hospital did, which survived Superstorm Sandy, as well as a housing unit. But those were private, one quote unquote facility, even though it was a whole university with a whole university complex, nonetheless one facility. And Cornell, I think, is either Cornell or Colgate, has also done the same thing. So I think you're absolutely right that a distinction should be made between hybrid looking to serve most of a community or all of a community, but at the same time, microgrids aim to serve critical facilities, and it could be just a single facility. And then, would the tariff facilitate that, or would some other arrangement to interconnect with the utility, an interconnection agreement or PPA or whatever, be more appropriate? Because obviously, the bigger and more complicated the system, right, the more technical controls you would need on both sides, sender and recipient, to make it work. And that may be beyond the capabilities of the tariff per se, putting aside the 1 megawatt limitation. So I hope that kind of responds to your question.
Jerry, thank you so much. Yeah, that really did. That was helpful. Thank you.
Sure, thanks.
Were there any additional follow-up questions to that?
Yeah, if Commissioner Potter is finished with her questions, I didn't want to steal any of her thunder, and I apologize for speaking out of turn. I had microphone issues, so I wasn't able to say anything, but I'm glad that Commissioner Potter got to say something about at least this question. But I guess a follow-on to Commissioner Potter's questions around the objectives and whether or not they were adequately pursued. You know, I'm very grateful that the parties have brought in a lot of speakers to talk about the current microgrids that are out there currently, and how they work or they don't work, the failings, so as to get a better understanding of the learnings that we can have to make the next program or this program very successful. But I think a heavy emphasis was put on how can we avoid making a microgrid program. Let me rephrase that. How can we avoid making a program that would incentivize microgrids that don't exist currently? I think again, maybe as a comment, but also as a question, have the parties really thought about the potential future of this? It may not be that microgrids exist currently that currently can island and be fully self-sufficient for long durations of time. Maybe it's a question of not fully technical issues. Maybe the technical issue will kind of resolve themselves. Maybe it is an issue of compensation through another type of program to make it so that it is economically practicable to actually run these microgrids in a self-sufficient islanded way. But I'm not getting the feeling from the parties that that's really being kind of pursued. But it's fine. Again, I've been trying to say this whole time, it's fine whatever the parties want to do, but I'm just trying to point out there, again, it seems like we're trying to build this tariff and this program based upon what's already out there. And we size things based on what's already out there. You size it for a 2-year-old kid, your shirt's not going to fit when the kid's 3 years old. So again, to the parties, are you thinking about these situations where we'll have advances in technology, advances in technological know-how to use these microgrids, and potentially advances within compensation and or development of compensation?
A good question. I can take a stab at it. So I'm hearing that you want us to, be forward thinking and how to, be proactive. So when technology is more advanced and costs come down, that there is a pathway. Is that correct? Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that what we're suggesting is this can be done through other existing dockets, namely the DER docket, because microgrids, right, are just a type of DER. And so I think just to keep things from getting, too much overlap, I think that's the way that we're leaning towards, but also again open to Marcia and Jerry's perspective on this, because I agree, that's not something we've discussed in greater detail, and we can commit some time for that in our next meeting.
Andrew, that's a really good question. I think, thought has been given to that. I think, in some ways, what we're doing in the microgrid kind of relates to what's happening in DER, what's happening in IGP. And so, I guess one example would be, for grid services. So, there's nothing really stopping a development of a microgrid to bid into the GSPA RFP. And that would provide, I guess, the opportunity for that microgrid to develop and get compensation that way. Yeah. I think what's kind of challenging, looking at trying to figure out what the rates would be specifically for microgrids, you kind of want to make sure that all the rates are kind of consistent across the programs, I think, so that everything is kind of, fair and reasonable. And looking from, the ratepayer side is trying to get as cost effective, agnostic, technologies onto the system. Yeah. So thought has been given to that. And I think, one of the things that I took back internally was really the level of cost that developing a microgrid, looking at California, the funds that they're looking at is, 200 million for 15 projects. Yeah. And really, how do we set that amount to make sure, ratepayers looking at across all the technologies, right, is getting a cost effective, resource onto the grid. And I think, one of the things that we are looking at is kind of like the feasible, I guess the process itself. I know, Andrew, you've been, and several of the staff have been in our meetings. Yeah. And so really it's kind of looking at the communities to determine what are the, facilities that need to be, um, get that emergency power, looking in the near term. Yeah. Trying to address that kind of immediate need. And then, thinking into the future, I guess, that system can develop right later on. But right now we need more information, yeah, to do that, I think. I don't know if that helps, Andrew, but that's been kind of our struggle to kind of try to figure out, balancing the cost with all the other resources, trying to meet kind of the immediate need of trying to get emergency power to those facilities that, Commissioner Potter, you kind of noted, right? Like the community center, the first responders, right?
If I could possibly supplement Kristen and Marcy. Andrew, when you look at a microgrid, it really has, besides the need analysis factor, it really has, I guess, to simplify it, two components. One is the power source to provide what the microgrid is supposed to provide. And the second is the equipment or the intermediary element that takes the power and delivers it the way it's supposed to be delivered to the microgrid. And when you talk about, taking into account technology and maintaining that flexibility for technological developments, I think by nature, how microgrids and anything else develops kind of does that. And that many of the projects on the mainland that both utilities and private sector parties are doing, and there are a number of them out there, Schneider and SNC and Enchanted and so forth, they appear to be on the cutting edge of both adopting to and using, as well as helping to invent the new technology. But again, to bring it down to earth, in a microgrid situation, the new technology could ultimately derive new sources of power, such as backpack safe nuclear power plants that people have been talking about. And they could also, and probably are going to, provide tremendous innovations in the artificial intelligence side of all of the control and monitoring systems in microgrids. So, those were sort of automatically come into play, and the tariff itself sets a broad framework as to how these things are to be either structured or implemented. So I don't think the tariff necessarily discourages or inhibits, adoption of technological advances. The key for at least the foreseeable future, I think in our minds, and certainly in my mind, and this has been a real bugaboo of mine for a long time, trying to figure out, okay, how do we get around this one, is what's going to be your backup power source. You can have wind and possibly even solar and certainly energy storage, but even if we can have 6-hour batteries, from the 4 we have now, that's still going to be limited. And our disaster scenario of a Cat 4 or 5 hurricane where power is out for 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks, that's not going to make it. So the question is, what's going to be the backup power source? And that's where the difficulty is in the Hawaii context at this point. So that's, I think, why we've not necessarily addressed, the issues that you raised, which are key issues, but we've not really addressed them in as much detail as perhaps the others.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry and Marcy. Yeah, that kind of goes back to how we wanted to keep the discussions and the focus of this working group on the most practical applications in Hawaii that we could see impacts right away, and not be as theoretical and have it be a theoretical exercise, which there is value to that. So again, we'll set aside some time in the next meeting to discuss more. Okay, should I move on to the last question?
Were there any other follow-up questions to number 3? Okay, hearing and seeing none. Kristen, I think we can go to number 4.
Okay. So the last question was going back to Act 200. And so the question was, do you believe the working group has or will sufficiently address these and other stated requirements? Are there any requirements that has not met or will not meet? And so this is going back to slide 3 that I presented earlier, but yes, in short answer, the working group does believe that we have sufficiently addressed the requirements of Act 200, and we believe that microgrids provide full opportunity for customers to participate in DER or grid service rates, programs, and procurements. And similar, in addition, we are working on a document to make that more clear, particularly for the utility planning process as well. And we hope that document, along with the ETIP final report, will also be a good resource for our customers, communities, and developers, and how to meet Hawaii's grid resilience goals.
Are there any follow-up questions to the working group's response?
Yes, I have one. Hi, thank you so much for going through all of these with us. We do appreciate it. We've been spinning our wheels too. So what I wanted to note is that the requirements of Act 200 did request that we look at resiliency and a host of grid services and different. And I read your preliminary report, and you said, that the grid services are already taken care of under DER, and the resiliency is being picked up by IGP. And so basically, the report that I read sounded like we didn't meet the requirements of Act 200 because we were dismissing all of the components that are being, that are being discussed in other proceedings. We're not including that in this report, even though there's an opportunity to describe or elaborate on the efforts that are being done in IGP and how that will help inform us in the future years or something along those lines. But but because you just dismissed so many of the objectives that we've identified that pertain to Act 200, it did not seem as though you had considered any different types of scenarios. For example, I know Jerry has mentioned several times that, what's the backup fuel? What are we going to do about that? Well, maybe we should consider some options or opportunities. Maybe the backup fuel is diesel for a limited period of time. And, and that how is that even regulated or monitored by is it Hawaiian Electric that says, oh, you have a bug and we need to take it out of commission? Or I think that there's plenty of opportunity to develop different scenarios for the in particular, the answers that you provided in the report that allow for contemplating solutions, not just saying we can't do it or it's being done somewhere else. And so I do not agree with you that you completed the requirements of Act 200. And I think that what you're going to have to do at this point is to determine what type of analyses or needs to be done in order to put this into perspective so that people can understand it. And I'm not talking about customer microgrids. I don't even want to hear about customer microgrids because it's just a DER, but we're talking about an aggregation of DERs. And so it isn't, when you say it's just simply a microgrid is simply a DER. No, it's a whole bunch of them put together in many cases. So, how are we basically looking for opportunities to proceed and move forward in a phase 3 so that we can elaborate upon this or prepare Hawaiian Electric for the future? And that will include microgrids. That it absolutely will. I mean, I think everybody has testified to that you've probably heard from. So this isn't something that we can just shirk off and say, oh, we created a draft tariff in the first phase, and it is good enough. It is good enough, and it is not good enough. We need solutions. We need options and opportunities. Not, and what we've talked about here today has looked at some of those scenarios where a microgrid would be applicable. And, I'm not asking for a cost benefit analysis. I'm just saying, let's elaborate on solutions rather than, on basically dismissing or shirking or putting on someone else's plate the responsibility to identify what kind of services that microgrids could provide. So thank you.
Oh, thank you for your feedback. That is helpful. I think we could do a better job detailing a bit more of that in the report. I think we had a lot of discussions on that, like Jerry was saying. And it's probably not coming through in the report. So that is good feedback for us, and we will take that back and elaborate more on those particular situations and potential solutions that we see and have a little bit more detail on that.
Thank you, Kristen.
Actually, I just wanted to follow up on Commissioner Potter's comments. Based on what I'm hearing from especially Jerry, and I agree with Commissioner Potter that the preliminary report is a little dismissive, but it seems like you folks did consider a lot of opportunities and options. It just was not included in the draft report to give us as commissioners an idea of what we need to consider in implementation of the next phase. And simply, I agree with Commissioner Potter, simply saying it's being handled in another docket or another proceeding, that doesn't help us. We need a little bit more firm, concrete directives so that we can come up with solutions and work with everyone to address this issue. And again, I think Jerry provided some really good thoughts and things, and I hope a lot of what he discussed is included in the report so that it gives us opportunities to follow up on.
Yeah, no, again, thank you for the feedback. Yes, the draft report that we circulated, that was our first draft, so we do recognize it. It was, very bare bones and skeleton approach, and it was more just meant to see that we were going in the right direction. So it sounds like we are, but we just need to elaborate more on the end result, the end solutions and recommendations. Okay.
Actually, Kristen, could I add something?
Yeah.
I think, we haven't sent out that
Appendix document.
overview,
Yeah.
the appendix
yeah.
document.
Yeah.
And I think part of it hopefully can get addressed in the appendix document. I think
Mhm.
part of it is kind of looking at communities and what their needs are and what resources that they would like to see, which is kind of part of the ETIP process. I think it's not trying to point there, but I think it's trying to lay out the process, hopefully, for the next phase. I think we'll take a look with the comments today, take a look at that document and see. Hopefully, it'll address the comments that were raised today. Thank you.
Were there any other follow-up questions or comments?
Yeah, actually, this is Anon. Just maybe a comment. It might be helpful in the working group report. I noticed the next steps may be helpful to include in that sections. Like considerations on what the working group considers to be like further actions they need to take. I know this was more like a learning process. This kind of part in phase 2, but maybe kind of how do we implement what we learned basically. That would be helpful, I think. So this way we have something more tangible, like the book commissioner was mentioning. We need kind of more tangible, like deliverables, that we can put more meat to the bones. Yeah, it'll be helpful in terms of providing in the report. Yeah, for us. Thank you.
Yep, thanks, Anon. Noted. We'll definitely include that.
Any other questions or comments at this point? Okay, hearing none and seeing no hands raised, we are still in our question and answer period. So if there are any, I think commission staff, if you have any other questions regarding Hawaiian Electric's, the working group's presentation, you can ask them now. Right. If none, I'll open it up to the commissioners if you have any other questions to ask at this point regarding the presentation and updates.
We've been going at this for several years now in this proceeding, and and it's familiar faces every time, and that means that you're not asking to get off of the responsibility of this docket, and that you're choosing to be here, which is excellent. And I commend you for seeking out experts and those developers to help inform the process. And while as been noted earlier, that we're not apples to oranges on the mainland. We have definitely way more constraints than they do over there. But we have, that's all the information that we have at the time, and you have done a terrific job of seeking out speakers to come and inform you in this process and in this stage of this phase. And so I do want to commend you for that. It's remarkable to see how many working groups you had with really stellar speakers. So, and then in terms of getting this report right, we at the commission want to ensure that it is right. And so that might mean like a second or third or fourth draft, because there are certain things that we would like to see that probably are in your head and you can't read our minds. So we're just going to have to go through some iterations in order to make it, for, like as Anon says, it's something that is a little bit more tangible, and then as Naomi says, is not as dismissive and has areas that incorporate some of these ideas, but they're just not elaborated on. And that's pretty much the same thing that I said. So I think the next opportunity to really refine that report and then provide it to us is excellent. But I would expect that you'll probably get comments back again, and we'll go through this at probably at least one or two iterations. So and that is an opportunity for us to be reviewing the work in real time and providing real time feedback to you. And so it's actually a good thing. I know it seems like we're not kicking the can back to you and saying like you deal with it. We really want to be responsive and and helpful in this process as well, because we know that we've asked a lot of you during this proceeding. This has not been the easy part. This has been very challenging, and so recognizing that fact that you responded so well and have is just thank you. Just thank you so much for your service. We appreciate it. So that's all I have for today.
No, I just want to say thank you, commissioners and commission staff, for your feedback. And yeah, we look forward in our, we want to hear your feedback and get your involvement in the report. So yeah, we welcome the opportunity and we thank you for your attention to this as well.
Yeah, and I reiterate Kristen's thank you. This was really helpful. And sorry, I think a lot of the things, and Jerry, I think, brought it up more succinctly, I think wasn't quite coming out in the report. And I think we have to give more thought on addressing the comments. I think one thing I kind of wanted to highlight, though, I think, thinking about it, I think we're trying to figure out how to get as much of the community comments. And some of that is kind of ongoing now through the ETIP process, because, what their needs are and what they want to see in resources in their particular area, I think will be important. And that's something probably we will need to highlight a little bit better. And then with the objectives. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you very much.
So I think at this point, we
So actually-
have, sorry.
Oh, so just one
go
quick thing, sorry. Just to add to what Commissioner Potter's her comments on the report, it would be helpful for us as staff when we review the report is that, how you already started this, you identified the objectives, the priority, items, and then next to it, your position on that, right? And then after that, what steps you want to take, action, no action, wait, and then a justification for that. That kind of helps us, in our process. And then this will help us to give better feedback and guidance to you after, we see the first draft. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, I got it. No, that's helpful to hear. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Danon. So at this point in our conference, we've sort of combined, I think, the question and answer period with the open comment period, which is fine. But I will open the floor now to anyone who wants to answer or to ask any questions about the presentation or in general, or to offer any comments or other feedback at this time. So again, please raise your hands and we will call on you. Andrew?
Yeah, sorry, I'll go really fast. I had a few questions, but I think I'll just ask one. Along the lines of what Anand's reiterated from Commissioner Potter's statements, she made. I noticed the parties again have been concentrating their efforts on case studies of potential and existing microgrid projects, and again, we're very grateful that the parties have kind of pulled together all of the resources, and got these developers to provide their valuable time to us so that we can learn. But it does not appear the parties have considered implementation of resiliency features above and beyond those seen and existing and planned microgrid projects. So my question is, do the parties believe an appropriate avenue to adding resiliency features after commenting that they do not want to add it in the tariff? Is it best done outside of the tariff, but within this proceeding as potentially a programmatic approach?
That's something we can bring up in our next meeting as well. I think we've touched upon it briefly, but we haven't really had an in-depth discussion. I think our assumption is that this proceeding was primarily around the tariff, so it might get complicated to introduce a program within this particular docket, but we can definitely talk about that more.
Actually, I was wondering, Andrew, I guess by program, because I guess we're kind of the appendix that we're working on, you're kind of laying out a process, I think, that involves the community, utility, and ways to find out more information, I think, to kind of facilitate the development of, I guess, to address the community needs, for resiliency, which can include microgrids or other things. I think, is that what you're kind of thinking of, Andrew, or like a program like DER?
Yes, potentially. I want to keep it as open as possible. You know me.
Okay. Thank you.
Does anyone else have questions or want to offer any feedback? All right, hearing none, and I see no hands raised. So that will conclude our question and answer period, as well as, oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Kauai?
Sorry, Ashley, I accidentally pressed the wrong button.
Okay, so no questions?
No.
Okay, thank you. All right, so with that, we'll close our question and answer period as well as our open comment period. And we'll move over to, we'll start our wrap up. So throughout this conference, the working group and the parties and all attendees have heard some guidance from the commission staff as well as the commissioners as to the working group report. If there is any specific and other specific guidance, we will probably be issuing formal guidance shortly to help guide the parties. As a reminder, just in general, based on review of the draft report so far, we're hearing that the working group is being asked to find and provide solutions for the challenges that they've identified in the draft report, and must also address these additional requests that the commission and commission staff has provided. If the working group feels they do need more time to address these additional reporting requests, we ask that you inform the commission of that as soon as possible. And at this time, I invite Commissioner Potter to make any closing remarks.
Thank you, Ashley. I appreciate it. So as many of you know, this is my last status conference with the Microgrid group. And so I will miss you all dearly. It's been an amazing ride. I think that we have all learned a tremendous amount, and even, still are to the day. I took a whole bunch of notes based on your presentation, and which means you're doing your homework and you're doing a really good job at it. But I do want to impress upon you the importance of looking at solutions and options within the report, that is going to be highly critical. And even identifying a scenario where we are talking about load centers, which would be like community centers or emergency services, and why, where, because we're not going to, those are never going to provide grid services. So each kind of application is unique, and so I want to think through more of the emergency response and then some of the optional response, but those are going to be two different models. And so thinking about what it is that we're trying to accomplish through the tariff is really critical at this juncture with the report that you will be issuing to us in a month or so. So I invite you to buckle down and really kind of think through how can we find solutions and paths forward and be technology agnostic, and consider that precision is not required at this juncture. I mean, we don't have to precisely identify every type of component that would go into a microgrid, but what we do need to understand is how the tariff needs to change, or what needs to be altered in a situation that is not as dismissive as the one that you provided in the first report. I think that as you both, Marcy and Kristen, have elaborated, that you actually have more meat to that content, but it's just not in there. So we'll be really excited about seeing that. And so one thing I would, even just to the commission staff, what I would recommend as well is, we may anticipate that final draft that we're looking for on the 23rd, I believe, would probably need to be pushed back. And that's an option for you all and for that timeline, because we want to get it right, and we want to make sure that it's a robust analysis, and that that you're providing us with the tools and information that we need in order to really contemplate how microgrids can be applicable in Hawaii. And so that is my request of you, and definitely good luck. And I'll read it when it's posted, by the way. All right. Well, thank you all so much. I really do appreciate all the effort that you've put in this over the years, and it's just been such a great learning curve, and you all have been fabulous. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Potter. So just as a quick overview of what the current schedule is, our next steps coming up. So again, right now the phase 2 working group report is due on November 23rd. Again, if the working group feels that they need to extend that, please let us know as soon as possible. Also, we have our technical conference scheduled for December 8th, and draft revised Microgrid Services Tariff and related documents due on January 6th. And parties will submit their comments by February 6th. As a final note, the working group has already filed their slides from today into the record. If there were any changes to the slides that were filed earlier this week, we asked the working group to please file an updated deck as soon as possible. If not, no need to refile your slides. The Commission will also be filing its slides into the record shortly. So this concludes today's status conference. We thank all the parties and all the participants for their feedback and discussion here. I think this was a lot of information and good information to work from, and we hope that the working group has some good feedback as they continue along with the rest of this phase. So we thank you all again for your presence and your participation, and we hope to see you again on December 8th for our technical conference. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.